things like titanium and tungsten and carbon fiber and Kevlar specifically. And I don't really know why, but I found Kevlar really, really interesting. It was invented by this lady who was working for DuPont back in 1965. And the company DuPont was looking for new and interesting materials that they could make and then sell on the marketplace for all kinds of different stuff. And so she was experimenting with these synthetic polymers and ended up finding this really interesting polymer that they could create and weave together and became this really fascinating, for me, material that's 5 times lighter and stronger than steel. And over the years, Kevlar's been made into all kinds of stuff. Everything from, I guess they started using it in racing tires, which is pretty interesting because when I think of Kevlar now, I think of things like body armor, right? But they use it for all kinds of stuff like bike tires and cell phones. There's Kevlar in some cell phones, gloves, obviously the bulletproof vests, motorcycle gear, hockey masks, logging chaps. I don't know if any of you do logging a whole lot, but logging chaps, they've got Kevlar. And even ping pong paddles, the really high-end ping pong paddles, not the ones that I use that are garbage and missing all the little dotty things that give you the extra grip, but really high-end ping pong paddles are made out of Kevlar. Isn't that weird? Probably the most important and coolest thing that was ever made out of Kevlar in my life, though, was the Oakley Kevlar wallet that I bought when I was in high school. My very first job was a sales associate at the Sunglass Hut downtown in the Salem Center Mall. I was right next to Victoria's Secret, which always made me really embarrassed, and I blushed a lot walking to work. But one of the cool things about working at the Sunglass Hut is you got discounts on Oakley merchandise. And so I remember one of the first purchases I ever made was a Kevlar Oakley wallet, and I carried this thing everywhere. I was really impressed by it. I knew that it was just the coolest thing in the world. It was very 90s of me, which was fine because it was the 90s. But it was just really, really cool for a high school guy. I loved this little Kevlar Oakley wallet. And one afternoon, I was over at my girlfriend's house, and I was showing her little brother my cool Oakley Kevlar wallet that, because it was made out of Kevlar, obviously was bulletproof. I was in high school. I was probably 16, 17 at the time, which meant that my girlfriend's brother was like 6, maybe 7 at the most, Connor. And he was about the twins' age. And he was properly impressed with my Oakley Kevlar wallet because it was bulletproof, obviously. But being a 6 or 7-year-old, Connor really wanted me to prove to him that it was bulletproof. And I didn't need to impress this little kid, right? I mean, I was a high school student. I didn't have anything to prove. But I thought, you know what? If I did prove this to him, if I earned some points with him, maybe in turn that would earn me some points with my girlfriend, his oldest sister that I really, really liked and had this crush on. And so I thought, you know what? Okay, we can do this. I will prove to you that my Kevlar Oakley wallet is bulletproof. But I wasn't an idiot. I knew this thing wasn't specifically designed to take the full impact of a high-caliber rifle round. But I didn't have a handgun on me because, I was 16 or 17. And so I grabbed the next best thing that I had available to me, and that was a .22 long rifle. And so I had this .22 rifle, and what better way to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that your Kevlar Oakley bulletproof wallet was indeed bulletproof than to shoot this thing while it's in your back pocket. Now, the problem that I was having is because I didn't have any other guns with me at the time, and I got the .22 rifle from the front closet of my girlfriend's house. The problem was because it was, because you always put your wallet in your back pocket. It was a rifle, and I couldn't shoot it myself. And the only other option was the 7-year-old that was standing next to me. But again, I wasn't an idiot, right? Come on, clearly. And I was pretty sure that Connor was not as good of a shot as he was trying to convince me that he was. And so I did the only thing that was logical in this situation, wanting to prove that my Kevlar Oakley bulletproof wallet was indeed bulletproof to this young man. Is I took my Kevlar wallet, which is in a box somewhere in our garage. I know it is, I just could not find it this weekend. But I took this wallet out of my back pocket, and the only logical thing to do, obviously, was to put it in my front pocket. Right? That's the only logical thing you can do. You know how most guys have a really cool story about some scar that they got while they were in high school? Well, it was about the time that I was slipping my obviously bulletproof Oakley Kevlar wallet into my front pocket that the doubts began to creep into my conscience. What if this thing wasn't actually fully bulletproof? What if I shot myself in the upper thigh and then had to hobble into the house and ask my girlfriend's mom to drive me to the ER? Or even worse, what if we had to call an ambulance and my dad heard the call come in over dispatch while he was on duty? That would not go well for me. And so I figured, you know what? I'm sure it is bulletproof. I'm sure it is. But the excuse that I gave Connor of why I did not shoot it while it was in my front pocket was that I didn't want to ruin my jeans. Obviously, the bullet would stop when it hit the wallet, but I would still have a hole in my jeans. And, I mean, come on. Nobody wants to walk around with a hole in their jeans. That's not in fashion, at least not in the 90s. And so I took my wallet out of my pocket, and I placed it against this stump, and I walked back, I don't know how far, not very far, and I shot this thing right in the middle of the wallet. I mean, right in the middle of my wallet. And because there was no reason not to believe that my Kevlar Oakley bulletproof wallet would not stop this bullet, there was no reason to take out my driver's license or my debit card or the cash or any of the stuff that I had in my wallet. I mean, there's just no reason for that, right? And so I shot this thing because I was as good of a shot as I said, unlike Connor, who was 6 or 7. And so I walked up to the stump where I was obviously going to find a crumpled, deformed bullet sitting right underneath this bulletproof Kevlar Oakley wallet. And when I walked up to it, it was that moment when I saw a small, odd hole in the middle of this wallet that I began to realize an interesting and important truth about Kevlar and armor in general. Just because it could be armor doesn't mean that it's meant for combat. Doesn't mean that it's meant for combat. And this week, we're going to start a series on the armor of God. These 10 verses in the middle of the final chapter of Paul's letter to the churches in and around Ephesus hold within them, these 10 verses, the famous armor of God. And it's in this letter that Paul writes to these people. And he begins to tell them what it means to be the church. What it means to be a group of people that is called out from the lives that they used to be living, who hears the gospel and begins to understand it, begins to wrestle with it, begins to allow the gospel to change their lives. He begins to talk to them about what it means to be the church. And oftentimes in the church world, we talk about wanting to create a place, to create a space that's really welcoming, right? Where everybody that walks in the doors feels loved, right? And that's incredibly important. That's something we try to do here at Oasis. It's something that the people of Jesus, the people who hung out with Jesus the most, who knew him the best, who spent the most time with him, those people always felt welcomed by Jesus. They always felt the love of Jesus, the people who knew him best. But for me, the most interesting thing is that the people who knew him the least, the people who had just met him, felt that same thing. And the incredible thing about Jesus, it isn't just that people felt welcomed around him, that felt comfortable around him, that wanted to be around him and felt this love. It was the fact that because of that welcome, because of that love, because of the culture that Jesus created around him, people were called into a life and began to be radically transformed into something more than what they were when they first arrived. Because that's the effect that the gospel has on us, right? The people of God. We get to experience firsthand the radical transformation that the gospel has on us. And that's what Paul begins to write to these people in the churches of Ephesus. What that looks like to be the church. When God, the physical embodiment of God, sees you where you're at, in the muck, in the mire, in the filth, with the stains on your hands and in your heart and on your mind, when you're sinking into the garbage that surrounds you, and the God of the universe shows up right where you're at, and with powerful, loving hands reaches down and pulls you out of your own filth and sets you on dry, solid ground and begins to dust you off and clean you up, to transform you into the person that you were designed to be. And as the church, not only do we get to experience that firsthand for ourselves, but we have the honor and the privilege to play a role in that process in the lives of the people who walk through our doors, who God places in our path. We get to play a role in that transformation as well. And this is what Paul is talking about as he writes this letter to the Ephesians. As he lives with these people for 3 years, working alongside them and ministering with them and sharing life with them for 3 years, these people that he loves. But Paul looks back and he writes them this letter from a Roman prison about the powerful good news of the gospel, the reality of what the church can be when it gets it right. And then he spends some time giving them some illustrations about what that actually looks like. Some of them you've probably read before. You've probably heard them if you've been in the church world for long. The image of a living temple of God. This image of the church as a body in perfect harmony. All players, all people playing their proper roles. This image of a family, a beautiful family who serves and loves with self-sacrificial giving. And as Paul comes to the end of this letter that he's writing to these people, that he knows so well and spent so much time with, and as he gets to the very end of this letter, the very final thought that Paul writes to them is this image of the armor of God. It's the last lesson, the last thoughts of a man who, at this point, doesn't think he's ever going to see these people again. Because he was in prison. He was literally writing this in chains. And so his final thought is this. And if you'll turn with me to the book of Ephesians, we're going to be in chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 10, and we're going to go through verse 19. And so you can grab your Bibles, whether it's your phone or your tablet or your paper Bible, whatever you prefer. This is where we're going to spend the next couple of weeks, wading through what Paul was talking about as he gives them this analogy. I'm going to be reading out of the New Living Translation. It's just the translation that I prefer when I'm doing my personal devotions. You can read it out of whatever translation you want. But here's what Paul says to the Ephesians. Chapter 6, starting with verse 10. A final word. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you'll be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Therefore, put on every piece of God's armor so that you'll be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil. Then, after the battle, you will still be standing firm. Stand your ground, putting on the belt of truth and the body armor of God's righteousness. For shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news so that you will be fully prepared. In addition to all of these, hold up the shield of faith to stop the fiery arrows of the devil. Put on salvation as your helmet and take the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Stay alert and be persistent in your prayers for all believers everywhere. And pray for me too. Ask God to give me the right words so that I can boldly explain God's mysterious plan that the good news is for Jews and Gentiles alike. I love that. These are the final thoughts of Paul to these people that he knows and loves so well. And as we camp here for the next few weeks and look at these verses and these different items that Paul begins to talk about, I want you to be able to remember that the people that Paul was writing to didn't have to think what this would mean in their mind. This wasn't like a cognitive mental experiment for them where they would use their imaginations to imagine, what a helmet looks like and what a breastplate looks like and what is a shield and how. This was reality for them. I mean, they could just step out their front doors and they would see Roman soldiers. And they would be wearing armor like this. This is the Roman lorica segmentata. This was the armor that was in use for about the 300-year period that I will do you a favor and not go into all the historical fun facts of this armor. It's my favorite. But if you want to know, you can feel free to talk to me afterwards because I've done lots of research on it and it's fascinating. So, the cool thing that I think when I'm reading through this stuff and I'm trying to, what I try to do, I don't know how you guys read the Bible, but when I read Scripture, I try to put myself in the place of both the author, the person who's writing these letters, who's writing this stuff down. What's going through their mind? What kind of emotional baggage? What's happening in their life? I try to put myself in their shoes, and I also try to put myself in the shoes of the people who are receiving these letters, especially the letters from Paul. People who are living in very specific cities, in a very specific culture, in a very specific time period, who had a viewpoint of the world, who knew what was going on around them to some degree, but it was a very different world than we live in right now. And when Paul was writing this letter to the Ephesians, he was in a Roman prison. And he was literally in chains. In fact, verse 20 talks about how he was in chains writing them this letter. And in a Roman prison at that time, he would be guarded by at least 2 Roman soldiers who would be wearing this armor. And so as Paul's writing this letter or transcribing this letter, he was probably looking at these soldiers. He was probably looking at the armor that they were wearing, at the helmets that they were wearing, at the shields that they were carrying, the swords at their sides. This was not just some ethereal practice for Paul. He was looking at it and knew the importance of being ready and fully prepared for battle. But not the type of battle that these Roman soldiers would be engaged in if things went south, but the kind of battle that his brothers and sisters in Christ would be engaged in all the time. And so he begins his very final thought. After this entire letter, and he begins to close this thing out, he begins his final thought with these words. Verse 10, a final word. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor so that you'll be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. Now the Greek word that Paul writes here, I don't know how many of you like Greek. I don't like it, but I have to use it. But the Greek word that he uses here is the word diabolo. And it comes from the root word that means the false accuser or the slanderer. It's where we get the Spanish word diablo. And it's the word that when you read through Scripture, it's most often, other than I think 3 maybe 4 times, it is almost always translated the devil. He goes on in verse 12 to explain why I think why he uses this word. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. Paul does his best to make sure that the people who would read this letter, not just the Ephesians, not just the people who lived in Ephesus that would get this original letter, but the people of Ephesus would then copy the letter and send around. Because that's how these things worked. Somebody would send you a letter, and if it was deeply spiritually edifying, like a letter from the Apostle Paul, you would get it, you would read it to your congregation, you would pass it around, people would begin to copy it and send it to their family in other cities, and these things would spread like wildfire. And so as Paul writes this letter, knowing the people who would read it, and knowing that other people were probably going to read it as well, he did his best to make sure that they knew that they were going to be in a battle. But it wasn't a battle that would require them to fight physically. It wasn't a battle that would require them to maim or kill other people who are made in the image of God. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies. And I don't know about you, but my temptation is always to look for an enemy to fight. I seem to always have an enemy that I want to fight. I always have somebody that I want to argue with. I would have some sort of battle or fight that I want to be a part of. And you always want to make sure that you've got a clear-cut view of who your enemy is, right? I mean, that's one of the first rules of war. Know your enemy. Battle gets really, really complicated if you don't know who you're fighting. And that's why in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it was logistically simple battle because everybody wore brightly colored uniforms, right? You had your color and the enemy had their color, and you would line up and everybody would be in these big lines and you'd fire and you'd hope not to get shot. I mean, it was easy peasy. It was a pretty simplistic type of battle. You knew who the enemy was. You knew who the good guy was. You were on the good guy side. They were on the bad guy side. You had the good guy colors. They had the bad guy colors. You knew who the enemy was. And when we were fighting in the world wars, things became a little bit more complicated. And the enemy both looked more like us and wore similar type uniforms. And that's why in World War II, Franklin Roosevelt ended up sending massive amounts of Japanese American citizens into concentration camps because it was difficult to tell who the enemy was, and it was better safe than sorry. And then you get into the Vietnam era, and you go into a country, and you have no idea who you're fighting. And nobody wears uniforms. And the enemy not only looks exactly like the civilians that you're there to protect, but they're living among the civilians that you're trying to protect. And you have no idea where the enemy's at. And now we're in a time where we're dealing with homegrown terrorists and homegrown school shooters. And they're not just hard to pick out of a crowd. They are our citizens. They're our neighbors. And God forbid, they're our kids. How do you tell who the enemy is nowadays? It is incredibly critical in any battle, in any sort of warfare, to know who your enemy is when you go to fight. And so Paul writes to the believers in Ephesus, and he tries his darndest to make it crystal clear who the enemy is. That there is an enemy who is real, who is active, and there are those who are not enemies. And it's not those in the church that you disagree with, and it's not those outside of the church. It's not even those who are hunting him down and arresting him and throwing him in prison and would eventually execute him. They were not the enemy. And it would have been very easy for Paul to point the finger at the Romans and say, those guys are the enemy. If anybody needed proof that there was a war on Christianity, Paul was literally living proof. But he did not point them out as the enemy. In fact, he did the opposite. And not long after he wrote this letter, he would march to his own death, where he would be executed by the Romans. But he wanted to make it crystal clear that they were not the enemy. He explicitly tells his readers that there is an enemy. And it is never anybody that you stand toe-to-toe with. It is never anybody that you're going to look eye to eye with. We fight a war, as he says, against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. There is a battle, but it's not one that we're used to. You know, one of the greatest things that a Roman citizen was ever granted in this time period was called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. A Roman citizen, it is said, could walk the face of the earth without fear of harm, because you could always say 2 words to anyone that you came across that would guarantee your safety. Civis Romanus. I am a Roman citizen. It was a knowledge that was universally known that if you were to harm a Roman citizen, you would have the entire force of the Roman army to deal with. It's just something that no one did. Because that was the primary role and the basic essence of what an army was meant for. Protect the people. As a soldier, your job is to protect the people. And when we read the words of Paul, and he tells us that we're fighting a battle, not a battle against flesh and blood, but a battle that is against an enemy whose power is very different, whose tactics are very different, whose influence is very, very different. We're going to be needing to fight a different kind of battle. And it's easy to forget that our battle isn't against flesh and blood. Our feelings often get hurt, right? Our decision, there's decisions made higher up than we have authority to speak into that grind against the very basic knowledge of truth that we've come to know our entire life. Our leaders and sometimes our friends easily get categorized as the enemy. But let me remind you of what Paul reminded the Ephesians of. Your boss is not the enemy. They're not. Your aunt, your father, your cousin, your sister, your neighbor, they're not the enemy. They are non-combatants. They're actually the ones that we are here to protect from the enemy. And the best way to protect others is to be able to protect yourself. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. How to properly use the armor of God. How do you don this armor that Paul's talking about, this spiritual, ethereal, I don't really know what that means, armor? How do you use that? How do you practice that? How do you protect yourself and your family and those that God has placed around you with this armor of God, whatever that means? We're going to be talking about that for the next couple of weeks. But before I leave you tonight, I want to give you a couple of things to ruminate on over the next week until we gather together again next Sunday night. The first one is this. It's the phrase that Paul uses in verse 11. He says, put on all of God's armor so that you'll be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. Stand firm. The word that Paul uses here is the word histeme. Histeme. And it means to put into place, to make something so that it is absolutely immovable. I think in my head of a fence post. You dig a hole and you put a fence post in there and you pour concrete in there, and then that thing is, if you've done your job right, absolutely immovable. And it comes from the idea of the Roman soldiers who would close ranks and build this absolutely impenetrable wall of shield and armor that you just could not break through. And it can only be created, it can only be sustained, they could only stand firm as a Roman legion if their fellow soldiers to their left and to their right also were standing firm. That was the only way that histeme could work. It is with your brothers and your sisters on your right and your left, standing firm with you. And in the Roman army, there were no heroes. There was no individual identity in the legion. Every soldier was absolutely equal, and they were absolutely critical in the roles that they played. It was their training and their discipline that made the legions so formidable. It wasn't that they had star players. It wasn't that they had, incredible athletes or, there was no Goliath in the Roman legion. You hear stories of Roman generals, but no individual soldiers stood out because they worked as one unit together. And if you read ancient scholars and historians talk about the incredible nature of a Roman legion working together, they use words like beautiful, seamless, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men working together as a single unit. And that's what made them so strong. The problem is when you get out alone, when you pull away from your fellow soldiers and you try to go at it by yourself, you risk the reality of being surrounded by the enemy. And you can stand firm on your own all you want, but you're going to get taken down. That's just a fact of warfare. You fight alone, you die alone. And so the first thought that I want to leave you with is this idea of standing firm. It's why we put so much emphasis on the word community here at Oasis. It's why you hear me talking about community groups all the time. That sitting shoulder to shoulder in church, in our pews, is important and it's wonderful, and I love worshiping with all of you. But there is something incredibly dynamic about sitting in somebody's living room and looking each other in the eye and celebrating together and mourning together and watching each other's kids grow up. Stand firm means standing together. It's why we go on men's retreat. It's why we go on women's retreat. It's why we do family camp, to build those relationships, that shoulder-to-shoulder time. That's why I'm calling on all ladies who have anything to do with Oasis to be at the Oasis Ladies One Day event that's coming up June 1st, that starts at 9 o'clock, despite what your bulletin says. 9 o'clock. Write that down. Right? 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock. You heard it here first. It's because we were built and designed to live in community. We weren't built to go it alone. Stand firm by standing together. This summer, we're finishing up community groups. And as much as I love spending time in community groups, the summer comes and calendars should get full. I know our calendar's been full for the summer for months. And I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get anything done in the yard this summer. Will you do yourself and all of us a favor? Create opportunities for community. Come to Triangle Lake. Go to the women's one day. Hang out. Go to Derry. I don't care what you do. Play spike ball in the park. Meet together. Do not forgo gathering together. The summer is a busy time, and I totally get it. But if you wait to get back into the flow of community until the fall, don't go alone. Don't go it alone. The second thought is this. Paul's final thought to the church in Ephesus, the final thing that he writes to them, he's literally writing in chains in prison. He does not think he will ever see them again. And his final thought is about the reality of the spiritual world. It's not a joke. It's not a mistranslation from the Greek. It's not a fairy tale. It's the real deal. And I know as a guy who just 12, 15 years ago did not understand this at all and just kind of kept it at an arm's length and was like, it's for some people, but it's not my deal. You need to know this is reality. And if you're looking for a place to figure out, okay, what do we believe? What is a legit, non-crazy, non-nuts way to look at the spiritual world? I did a sermon on this a year ago, April. And I don't usually promote my own stuff, but I'm doing it right now, so you can deal with it just like I'm dealing with it. The message was in our prayer series, and you can find it on the website. You can grab it on the podcast or whatever you want to do, but it's called Battling Invisible Creatures. And it is the most basic, solid explanation of the reality of spiritual things that I can come up with. It's the analogy that I use when I explain this stuff to my boys, who are 9 and the twins are 7. And if they can get it and understand it, I'm pretty sure you can as well. And so listen to this if you need to know the basics of spiritual warfare. And if you have questions after that, if you need some clarification, if you're just like, okay, hold the phone, that's fine. I get that. I'm not going to push you into that. I totally get it. If you have questions, you're always welcome to contact Lana Ritter and Dave Hawkins. They'll walk you through some stuff. But know and understand the final thought of Paul to the churches in Ephesus was about this reality. The band's going to come up, and we're going to close the service out in a final song this evening. And I want to leave you with one thought as we kick this series off. The single greatest advantage that the Roman army had was not their weapons, although they were very impressive. It wasn't their armor, although that was impressive as well. It wasn't how huge the army was. It wasn't how much money that the Roman government was just pouring into their army at this point. And it was a lot. The single greatest contributor to the fact of incredible success that the Roman legions had was the fact that they were full-time soldiers. That was it. They were full-time soldiers. That there was a change made. And they went from volunteers and peasants who would get called up every once in a while and would show up and, we just hope for the best. They went from peasants and volunteers to full-time soldiers. They were men who lived and breathed the life of a soldier, who every morning when they woke up, they were ready to train. They were ready to spar. They were ready to march. They were ready to battle, to protect the people. They took this seriously. They lived this, they breathed this, they died doing this. It was everything to them. Can you imagine the world if every Christian on the planet were full-time in, 100% bought into this idea, who knew how to use the armor of God, who took this seriously, who lived it, breathed it, willing to give their lives for this? What if we trained with our armor on? What if we kept our swords sharp and our shields polished and our armor oiled? Can you imagine a world where the non-combatants, the people that we're here to protect could walk the earth without fear from their enemy because they were being protected, what would that world look like? I think that's a world worth fighting for, don't you?